Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Hey folks, just a quick heads up before we get started. Today's episode is going to be audio only. No video this time, but it's a good one. Stick around. Today, Israel is recognizing the self-declared state of Somaliland.
Somalia called on Israel to rescind its recognition of its breakaway region of Somaliland during an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council.
Will aligning itself with Israel help or hurt the breakaway region's case for independent statehood? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. Before we continue with today's show, remember to leave us a comment telling us what you think about this episode and what stories you might want to see us do next. Or if you're on your favorite podcast app, it's really great if you leave us a review, which tells us where you're listening from. And of course, giving us a 5-star rating really does help the show as well.
My name is Faisal. I'm a reporter who works primarily on East Africa with a focus on Somalia. I'm joining you today from Cairo after a week of reporting on probably the most consequential diplomatic development in East Africa in a generation.
Faisal, welcome to The Take. So we are talking in the wake of Israel's surprise announcement in December to formally recognize Somaliland, which is a breakaway region in the northwest of Somalia, which is home to more than 6 million people. So Israel is the first country to do so, and we'll get into some of the history in just a minute. But on its face, Israel and Somaliland seem like strange bedfellows. So what is Israel up to here? Why the sudden interest in this relatively small part of East Africa?
I think obviously the geography kind of speaks for itself in many ways. The Red Sea is a crucial artery between, on the one side, Europe and the East Mediterranean, and then on the other side, obviously, it opens up into the Indian Ocean and then East Asia, where you have some of the most dynamic markets and largest economies in the world. But specifically in terms of Israel's security interests, as of the beginning of the war in Gaza, the Houthis decided, obviously, to start shooting rockets around 2,000 kilometers from north of Yemen into Israel. In addition to that, implemented a naval blockade. From their perspective, what they were doing was implementing the genocide conventions, which require states in the international system to take measures against any actor committing or believed to be committing genocide. Israel, of course, is being investigated by the International Court of Justice. And so I think that episode with the Houthis exposed a critical vulnerability for the Israelis. I mean, we've seen the port of Eilat, which is a small slither between Jordan and Egypt, where the Sinai kind of forks the Red Sea, almost closed down last year. I think it had huge financial disruption. And that had big impact on Israel's ability to conduct commercial activity globally. But in addition to that, obviously, there's the security implications of having what is, it's become a state actor. Of course, the Houthis claim to be the government of Yemen, exchanging rocket fire with the Israeli government. So I think Somaliland offers them an opportunity to kind of sit directly across, if they're obviously granted that, because it's one of the big questions from the Houthis on the other side of the Gulf of Aden.
Okay, so it sounds like what you were laying out there was a good case for maybe putting like a military base in Somaliland or some sort of military presence or diplomatic presence. But what we're talking about here is recognizing Somaliland. Do you see those two things as linked?
Just for the benefit of the audience, basically, when the announcement was made on the 26th of December, neither Netanyahu nor the Somaliland president made any remarks about what was exchanged in order to kind of oil this deal, as it were. As of yet, we're still not entirely clear. What we know is the Somali president has said Israel intends to relocate forcibly displaced Palestinians from Gaza to Somaliland, and that Israel intends to have a military base on the Gulf of Aden. Somaliland's foreign ministry about 2 or 3 days ago denied that. I think the geography in many ways, though, does speak for itself. If Israel was recognizing this state directly across from one of its geopolitical and regional opponents, security would be expected to be one of the things that would be a consideration for both parties to this. I would say in addition to that, we've got reporting from Israeli media, Ynet, which suggested that the relationship between Somaliland's leadership and Israeli intelligence services goes back months, potentially even years. And then finally, Prime Minister Netanyahu actually thanked the Mossad chief specifically for making all of this possible in the readout for the announcement.
Let's do a little bit of the history. And look, you don't have to go back that far to a time when Somalia was actually formally divided into two separate entities. There was a British Somaliland protectorate in the north, while southern Somalia was under Italian rule. And then in 1960, the two merged to form the Somali Republic. But it has been an uneasy alliance, to say the least, ever since. So tell us a little bit about that tension and why Somaliland, in its own words, had to redeclare its independence back in 1991.
When Somaliland became independent, as you say, kind of a few days before the Italian administered region in the south, they were aware of the fact that they were ceding some of their authority, some of their power, in order to merge to form a much larger republic called the Somali Republic. There's a bigger story here as well, Kevin, that there were three other territories kind of in Somali national mythology, which were Djibouti, the eastern region of Ethiopia, and the northwest region, or northeast region rather, of Kenya, which were other territories which were kind of handed over rather, as far as kind of Somali nationalists are concerned, to Somalia's neighbors, and unfairly as well. And so that's been kind of a sticking point for Somali elites throughout the Cold War and then to some degree into the post-Cold War period. That union, as you say, between the north and the south, the British and Italian territory, initially kind of got off to a reasonably, it wasn't particularly a problematic start. There were kind of standard issues for a post-colonial state. How do you share wealth, revenue, power, the big questions like that. But over time, of course, a lot of that authority was consolidated in the capital Mogadishu to the exclusion of some of the communities in northern Somalia. And that exclusion and marginalization eventually became violent repression during the 1980s when some of the people in the north took arms and fought back against the government. The government eventually collapses in 1991. And a series of these political administrative entities kind of appear in Somalia. They would form later the nucleus of the Somali federal system, so Puntland, Jubaland, Southwest State, and others. Somaliland was the one state that decided to secede and declare independence in 1991 and kind of go its own path. Its argument basically was that the union wasn't working, that they preferred to have accountable governance, which was effective. And in any case, Somalia took a very long time to re-emerge in any kind of meaningful form from the civil war, which engulfed the country in the 1990s. And so Somaliland became a success story, if you will, in the north.
There was also a ton of bad blood from the 1980s because the bombings across Somaliland killed tens of thousands of people, right?
Absolutely. So the Somali government responded to the armed uprising with indiscriminate bombardment of two major cities in the north, which are Somaliland's two largest cities today, Hargeisa and Bur'a. The estimates vary. Some people have put the figure as high as 200,000 people being killed. But in any case, that remained fresh in the memory of a lot of people who remained concerned and worried about what it would mean to hand power and security back over to a government which had once treated the northern communities in that way. And so the rationale for seceding over time became much more powerful, much more obvious, not only because the project appeared to work a lot better than the rest of Somalia, but also because it improved the well-being and security of northern communities.
So what is Somaliland like today? I know it has its own flag, it holds elections, but how different would it be living in Somaliland compared to like a place in the south like Mogadishu?
I mean, the difference is, it's really a subjective question. I mean, if you're asking about the security situation in particular, large parts of Somaliland do a lot better. They host tourists, YouTubers kind of go there, you can kind of check it out.
Yeah.
There are tons of vlogs which are available. It does have its own currency, its own flag, a central bank and an army. Young people who have grown up, the last generation, post-1990 generation, have only known the symbols and stories that Somaliland has kind of offered them and cherish a lot of that. And so they're really attached to what it means to be from Somaliland. And I think political elites in Mogadishu don't really appreciate the extent to which that has changed. As far as the rest of the republic is concerned, I think the way people talk about Somalia as this kind of homogenous, really chaotic entity is definitely very outdated. The Northeast has a very stable region called Puntland. It also has something like an army. Obviously, constitutionally, it's not an armed force, but it operates in the same way. It has a parliament, has ministers, president. Because of issues that it has currently with the federal government, it operates effectively like an independent state. So it has a great deal of autonomy. And then there are other parts of Somalia which are under al-Shabaab rule, where security, of course, isn't as great. And the Somali armed forces, with the support of the US, are carrying out campaigns in some of those regions. And then Mogadishu itself, the Somali capital, of course, it's kind of surrounded by a hostile territory for the most part, governed by al-Shabaab. But security in the capital city itself over the course of the last years improved a great deal. The last major attack was in October. And this has been a point of pride for the president, who's mentioned it frequently in a lot of his interviews.
Well, I think that was a very good answer. I do feel like I have a better understanding of it because it does sound like it's very different depending on where you live. Now, Somaliland has been going at its own way for almost 35 years now. But I guess it can only go so far, really, without formal recognition, right? It will face limits to finance, investments. So it's understandable that it's looking for allies, and Israel so far is the only one to come calling. So try to give us maybe like a cost-benefit analysis as best you can. Like what would the risks of formally aligning with Israel be for Somaliland, and what would be the potential rewards?
I think they'd be delighted, obviously, with the fact that Israel, being a relatively powerful country with a very strong line into Washington, London, Paris, and other major Western capitals, which I'd imagine are the main targets for Somaliland's lobbyists and a lot of its supporters in terms of the campaign to have wider recognition of its independence.
However, not exactly the most popular country in the region.
Oh, no, definitely not. The timing has been off, and I think the images of Israeli flags in Somaliland's capital, Hargeisa, have been a bit jarring for other Somalis across the republic. You've seen some of the protests which broke out. Somaliland obviously is a Muslim majority country where pro-Palestine sentiment runs quite deep, and people are aware of the suffering of the people of Gaza in particular, and in the West Bank, of course, more broadly, quite deeply. But in terms of, strategically speaking, in terms of the gains for Somaliland, I think what they expect is that Israel provide them an ability to increase their capacity to offer security goods to Washington. But unfortunately, the day after the announcement was made, Donald Trump got on the phone to the New York Post, in which he said that he wasn't particularly interested. I think the reporter who was speaking to Donald Trump said, but they're offering you a military base. From the US perspective, they obviously already have a base in Djibouti, they have a base in Kenya. And so it's not clear what would be gained to have an additional position in Berbera. Trump obviously operates in a completely different way, but the lobbying succeeded in getting Somaliland mentioned in Project 2025, a really controversial kind of document that the Trump administration has distanced itself from, but we know is obviously linked to a constellation of individuals and institutions which operate around them.
We'll have more with Faisal after this break. So, Faisal, there's a long list of actors who are really unhappy about this. 14 of the 15 members of the UN Security Council, along with the African Union, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the European Union, and multiple states, particularly Arab states, have all denounced this move. To say nothing of Somalia's president, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, who called the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's recognition of Somaliland illegal.
This aggression and the blatant meddling constitute a clear violation of the international law, the Charter of the United Nations, the Constitutive Act of the African Union, and all established diplomatic norms.
So Somalia has spent years trying to emerge from a civil war. It's fighting armed groups like al-Shabaab. From Somalia's point of view, just how big of a setback do you think this is as it tries to rebuild after decades of war?
Somalia's president, a few days after, he addressed the parliament, Somalia's parliament, which isn't a particularly powerful institution, but he described this as one of the greatest dangers and threats to Somalia's sovereignty. And mind you, Kevin, this is a country which completely collapsed in 1991, fought a border war with Ethiopia in 1977, which is a much larger neighbor than Somalia. It fought another war with Ethiopia in 1964, was invaded by the US in 1991. Then the war on terror kind of happened in 2006. And so it's a country which knows war, trauma, and what it's like to have your sovereignty violated. For him to make these remarks were quite serious. to speak of this as a huge violation of Somalia's sovereignty might be a bit of an exaggeration from my perspective. Israel isn't creating a new reality. I think that's one of the things that they stress at the UN Security Council as well. They're just recognizing a situation which has been on the ground and taking advantage of it because Somalia's elites haven't been able to kind of figure out their own way forward out of this. Repeated talks have happened between Somaliland and Somalia going back to 1991. At their best, Kevin, they've been able to kind of sort out issues that Somaliland wouldn't be able to deal with itself, like aviation. You've got to have one authority in any nation state.
Yeah. In
terms of trade, in terms of allowing Somalilanders to travel both on Somali passports and then use those same documents if they need to access certain other services. But they haven't really reached that critical breakthrough of either pulling Somaliland back into the union with Somalia on terms that they'd be happy with, or finding a way for them to move forward and out of the union without harming unionist communities in the north. So I think this is one of the big things, Kevin, that's kind of missing in some of the reporting, is that there isn't total consensus in the territory that Somaliland claims for whether separation would be the best way forward.
So Faisal, none of this is happening in a vacuum, right? We've seen Israel, and particularly Israel's partner in the Abraham Accords, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, offering various levels of support for secessionist movements all over the region. I'm thinking of places like Libya or Sudan, or perhaps most notably, actually right across the Gulf of Aden in Yemen. Can you help expand that? Can you help us see what's happening with Somaliland as part of a broader picture?
So the UAE's relationship with Somaliland goes back to the early 2010s. I don't want to give you guys a full kind of deep look on the history.
That's okay, yeah.
But back then, Kevin, they were attempting to broker talks between the president of Somalia, I think it was Sheikh Ahmed at the time, and Somaliland's president at the time, Silanyo, and they didn't necessarily succeed in doing that. The Turks also made a great effort in terms of attempting to broker some kind of a way forward. But at some point around 2015, 2016, I think the Emiratis realized that it's better to just engage with Somaliland directly on terms that the Somali government can be happy with, i.e. they don't recognize Somaliland's independence from Somalia, but they kind of seek out ways to pursue commercial and strategic ties without kind of breaking that particular barrier or any of those kinds of diplomatic conventions which govern how states operate. Over time, that investment grew with huge developments at the port of Berbera. So from the UAE's perspective, of course, what they're doing is finding actors who they think can secure a territory, who have the clout and the capacity to govern reasonably well, and will look out for the interests the Emiratis have, whether they're commercial or security. And often those two things kind of blend together through a network of institutions, individuals, mercenaries, in some cases, as we've seen in Sudan. But in terms of the cohesion of the nation state, so South Yemen is another example of an area where the Emiratis have picked a local actor, built up the capacity of that local actor. The grievances of that local actor are relatively organic, and then they turn that into a state-like formation, which, you know, over time, some of these actors obviously want to secede from the country that they're a part of. And then in Sudan, it wasn't initially a secessionist movement, the Rapid Support Forces, and the government they formed. But over time, the sense that people are getting is that the country is being split down the middle. So you have Libya, which is kind of half and half. Somalia, for a long time, that has been the case. So I wouldn't just kind of plug it totally into this conversation in that way. But obviously, there are many parallels. So I'd definitely say that there is an extent to which the Emirates have played a very key role in bolstering a lot of these actors and developing their capacity to govern, and then obviously providing those goods to the UAE in return, whether they be security, commercial, or otherwise.
So to finish up, you've reported that Somaliland has over the years lobbied the Republican Party in the U.S. for recognition. Now, while the U.S. did defend Israel's move in the United Nations, it has said for now it will not change Somaliland's status. So maybe we end on some rank speculation from you. Do you think that this effort by Israel has helped or hurt Somaliland's case? Getting into bed with Israel and the Republican Party in the United States. Do you think that because of this, we'll see other countries soon recognize Somaliland? Putting you on the spot here.
We can go to the reportings and the statements by Somaliland's officials. I think now when they say recognition is near, a lot of people will take them a lot more seriously. And I can tell you as a reporter who's working on the region, I definitely am. The director of Somaliland's foreign ministry, about a week and a half ago, he said point blank with a great deal of confidence that this is definitely going to be the first of many. Somaliland's president said the same thing. And in the Somali community, there's been speculation about whether an African country will come next, or it will be a Middle Eastern country. And so I would say that in some circles, it's definitely done a great deal of harm. Those places where the attitude isn't so positive towards Israel at the present moment. But I think in some circles, their bet is that if they can kind of increase their clout, for example, with another Republican administration, or in the United Kingdom, where Nigel Farage, incidentally, the leader of the Reform Party and a potential future prime minister of the country, also viewed the development sympathetically. He released a tweet. I mean, to consider an opposition figure in the UK being aware of a development in what would otherwise be considered quite an obscure part of Africa, right? And so I would say the picture's mixed, Kevin, and increasingly the world is polarized along these lines. I was speaking to a lobbyist who works for Somaliland's government, and he made quite an interesting remark to me. He said the bet that they made was that the world was shifting to the right in any case.
Yeah.
And there's nothing they could do about that. And they didn't have success with the Labour Party to the same extent. The Democrats never really went ahead with making any move this way or that way on the Somaliland question. I think the bet is that now things have changed with Donald Trump. He's much more transactional. And if you can kind of make him an offer which will stick or will persuade members of his administration, you might succeed in doing that. And there's a part of the Republican Party which views Somaliland favorably. Ted Cruz has repeatedly said Somaliland is willing to work with us on issues of security in the Red Sea region. And what harvest that will bear, we'll have to see. But I don't think they're expecting recognition from Saudi Arabia or Egypt, countries which are looking upon this with great concern. They're looking elsewhere, and with the hope that the momentum can kind of continue.
All right. Sounds like Somaliland is putting all of its chips on Israel, Donald Trump, and Ted Cruz. So will that be a smart bet? I guess only time will tell. So grateful for your expertise and your reporting. Faisal Ali, thank you for coming on The Take today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with you guys.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Tracie Hunte, Sarí el-Khalili, and Melanie Marich, with Fatima Shafiq, Farhan Rafid, Tamara Khandaker, and me, Kevin Hirten. It was edited by Noor, Wazwaz, and Kylene Kiang. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Our video editors are Hisham Abu Salah and Mohannad Al-Melhem. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.